November 1981. Somewhere in the Norwegian Sea, a Soviet sonar operator aboard a Victor III-class submarine logged a contact he classified as biological. Whale, distant, moving south. He noted the bearing, the estimated range, and returned to his tea. 14 hours later, his captain surfaced to find an American P-3 Orion, circling overhead at 300 feet, dropping sonobuoys in a neat rectangle around his position. The aircraft had been there for 6 hours. The crew of the Victor III never detected it. What they also never detected, what the sonar operator had dismissed as a whale, sat 4,000 yards off their port quarter, at a depth of 800 feet, matching their speed and course with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. The contact report from that American submarine filled 11 pages. Speed, depth changes, reactor noise signatures, the exact moment the Victor III's crew ran a pump test at 2:15 a.m. Moscow time. The American boat recorded conversations bleeding through the hull. Not the words, just the vibration pattern of human voices, enough to confirm crew movement between compartments. The Soviet captain's name appears in the report. His boat's tactical number appears. His reactor's acoustic fingerprint, cataloged down to individual turbine blade frequencies, appears. The American crew knew that submarine better than its own engineering officer did. A Soviet naval intelligence summary from 1983, partially declassified in 2004, used the phrase acoustically invisible to describe what they faced. Their word, not mine. That American submarine belonged to the Los Angeles class. SSN-688 and her sisters, 62 boats built between 1972 and 1996, the largest class of nuclear attack submarines in history. If you've heard of them at all, you probably know the nickname, the 688s, fast attacks. The workhorses of the Cold War undersea campaign that the Soviet Navy spent 2 decades trying to answer and never quite could. The story everyone tells about these boats involves speed, or Tomahawk missiles, or the sheer number the United States Navy commissioned. Those details matter. They're also not the reason Soviet captains lost sleep. The reason Soviet captains lost sleep involved something far harder to quantify, a revolution in how quiet a nuclear submarine could be, engineered at a moment when the Soviet fleet thought it had closed the gap. They hadn't. The gap had widened, and they didn't know it yet, because the entire point of the Los Angeles class meant you never heard it coming. The Victor III's sonar operator in the Norwegian Sea wasn't incompetent. He held one of the most demanding technical ratings in the Soviet Navy. His equipment functioned within normal parameters. He simply faced a machine designed from the waterline down to make his job impossible. Every weld, every pipe mount, every turbine housing on that American boat existed to deny him the one thing he needed: a sound, any sound, loud enough to distinguish from the ocean itself. If this is the kind of story that grabs you, the engineering details behind who actually won the undersea Cold War and why, hit subscribe, leave a comment telling me which submarine class you want covered next, and drop a like so this reaches someone else who cares about what happened below the surface. The Los Angeles class didn't win the Cold War alone. No single weapons system did. But beneath the North Atlantic, beneath the Pacific, beneath the Arctic ice pack, where Soviet ballistic missile submarines hid their deterrent patrols, these boats turned the ocean transparent, but only in one direction. American captains tracked Soviet boats for days, sometimes weeks, compiling acoustic libraries so detailed that individual submarines could be identified by name from their engine noise alone. Soviet captains operated under standing orders to detect and report American submarine contacts. The reports came back thin, empty, maddeningly vague. A Soviet fleet commander in Murmansk reportedly told his staff in 1984 that tracking an American 688 required luck, not skill. He meant it as criticism of his own sonar technology. He could just as easily have been describing a law of physics. 41,000. That's the number of individual noise sources the United States Navy cataloged inside a nuclear submarine by 1968. 41,000 vibrations, hums, rattles, clicks, and resonances. Each one a potential death sentence. Pumps had frequencies. Valves had signatures. Every pipe bracket that touched the hull became a tiny loudspeaker broadcasting into the ocean, and the ocean carried those broadcasts for miles. The Americans understood this with an almost religious clarity. The Soviets understood it too. Both navies had the knowledge. They diverged on what to do about it. The Soviet Union built submarines to survive a war. That meant speed, depth, durability, and hitting power. Their design philosophy started with a question. If the shooting starts, can this boat get to its patrol station, launch its weapons, and endure the counterattack? Everything flowed from that calculus. The Alpha class dove deeper than anything the Americans had. The Papa class carried cruise missiles that could saturate a carrier battle group's defenses. Soviet titanium hull technology allowed operating depths that would crush an American boat like a beer can. These were extraordinary machines, innovative, built by engineers solving problems no one else even attempted. They were also loud. Not because Soviet engineers were incompetent, but because the design priorities demanded trade-offs, and quieting consistently lost. A reactor that could push a submarine past 40 knots required pumps that moved coolant at tremendous volume. Pumps that moved coolant at tremendous volume made noise. The Soviets knew this. They accepted it. Speed was survival. Depth was survival. Noise was a problem for peacetime. The American calculation ran exactly opposite. The United States Navy built submarines to fight a war that hadn't started yet and might never start. Their boats didn't need to outrun torpedoes. They needed to sit in the dark for weeks, listening, recording, tracking, and mapping every Soviet submarine movement across entire ocean basins without ever being detected. The mission wasn't combat. The mission was intelligence. And intelligence required one thing above all others: silence. Geography drove the divergence. The Soviet Navy operated from a strategic nightmare. Bases locked behind choke points that NATO monitored continuously. The Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, the Turkish Straits, the corridors of the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk. Every Soviet submarine that sortied into open ocean had to pass through narrow water, where American attack boats, maritime patrol aircraft, and fixed hydrophone arrays waited. The Soviets needed fast submarines because they needed to transit those killing grounds quickly. The Americans needed quiet submarines because they needed to be the ones waiting inside those killing grounds, unheard. By the early 1970s, both navies had nuclear attack submarines that could find and kill each other. On paper, the matchup looked competitive. The Soviet November class had given way to the Victor class. The American Sturgeon class represented the peak of first-generation quiet submarine design. NATO sonar operators still held an advantage, but the margin had narrowed enough that Soviet naval planners began writing optimistic assessments. Their new boats were getting quieter. American detection ranges were shrinking. The trend lines, if you extended them forward, suggested something approaching parity by 1980. Those assessments reached Washington. They landed on desks at the Naval Sea Systems Command, at Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, and at the Naval Reactors Branch, the small, ferociously guarded fiefdom run by Admiral Hyman Rickover, a man who had personally approved every nuclear submarine reactor the United States had ever built. Rickover read the intelligence. He looked at the Soviet trend lines. And he did something that would define undersea warfare for the next 30 years. He refused to accept the trajectory. The next American submarine would not be incrementally quieter than the Sturgeon class. It would represent a generational leap, a machine so silent that it would shatter the Soviet trend lines entirely and make every optimistic projection in Moscow irrelevant overnight. That submarine was the Los Angeles class. And the gap the Soviets thought they were closing was about to become a canyon, a photograph. Black and white, grainy, taken through what appears to be a periscope camera sometime in the mid-1970s. It shows the sail of an American submarine, probably a Sturgeon class based on the Fairwater planes, cutting through moderate seas at what looks like periscope depth. The photograph circulated through Soviet naval intelligence channels for years. It was pinned to briefing room walls in Murmansk, in Vladivostok, in the corridors of the Grechko Naval Academy, where the next generation of submarine commanders learned their trade. The caption, handwritten in Cyrillic, translates roughly to, "The adversary. Know him." What strikes me about the photograph isn't the submarine. It's the quality. Blurred, distant, taken at maximum zoom from what must have been considerable range. The Soviets had exactly one image of the thing they were supposed to defeat, and it looked like it was photographed through a shower door. The Soviet Navy's acoustic intelligence problem in the 1970s was not a lack of effort. It was a lack of data. To understand how quiet an American submarine actually was, you needed to record one. To record one, you needed to find one. To find one, you needed it to make noise. The circularity was vicious. Soviet acoustic laboratories could analyze recordings of American submarines only when Soviet surface ships or submarines managed to detect and track them long enough to gather useful data, which happened with decreasing frequency as American boats got quieter. The engineers tasked with designing countermeasures were working from increasingly outdated information. By the time a Soviet design bureau understood the acoustic signature of one American submarine class, the next class had already entered service, and the cycle started over. This irritates me more than it should. Not the Soviet predicament itself. That was simply the reality of technological competition. What irritates me is how often this story gets told as though the Soviets were stupid. They weren't. The engineers at the Malachite and Rubin design bureaus were brilliant. They understood acoustic theory as well as anyone at Electric Boat. They knew exactly what needed to happen to make a quiet submarine. What they couldn't do was make the Soviet industrial base cooperate. American submarine quieting required manufacturing tolerances that bordered on aerospace precision, machining reactor components to within thousandths of an inch, balancing turbine rotors to watch-grade standards, producing hull sections with welds so clean they introduced zero acoustic discontinuity. The United States had an industrial base that could deliver this. Not easily, not cheaply, but reliably. The Soviet Union had an industrial base that could build 10,000 tanks a year, but couldn't consistently manufacture a pump that met its own noise specifications. The design bureaus drew quiet submarines on paper. The shipyards built loud ones. This wasn't ignorance. It was tragedy. But back to the operational problem. By 1978, the Soviet Navy had reorganized its entire anti-submarine warfare doctrine around a concept called bastions. The idea was elegant in its desperation. Instead of trying to protect Soviet ballistic missile submarines across the open ocean, where American attack boats hunted them with impunity, the Soviets would concentrate their missile boats in defended areas close to home. The Sea of Okhotsk. The Barents Sea beneath the Arctic ice. These bastions would be ringed with surface ships, land-based aircraft, and attack submarines whose sole job was to keep American boats out. If you couldn't find the American submarines in the open ocean, you would create a perimeter and defend what was inside it. The bastion strategy revealed something the Soviet Navy rarely admitted publicly. They had functionally conceded the open ocean. Every submarine that sortied past the GIUK gap into the Atlantic operated under the assumption that an American 688 might already be following it. Standing orders told Soviet captains to conduct periodic clearing turns, sharp course reversals designed to unmask their baffles and check for trailing contacts. The maneuver became so routine that American submarine crews gave it a nickname. They called it Ivan's Crazy Turn, and they trained specifically to anticipate it, slowing and opening range in the minutes before a Soviet boat was statistically likely to reverse course. The Americans didn't just know the Soviet playbook. They knew the timing. The asymmetry was staggering. One Navy operated in constant anxiety about an enemy it couldn't detect. The other operated with the calm of a predator that had already located its prey and simply needed to keep watching. The 688 class didn't create this asymmetry alone. It inherited decades of American acoustic research, industrial capability, and strategic patience. But it was the instrument that made the asymmetry operational. The machine that turned theoretical advantage into Soviet captains ordering clearing turns every 90 minutes and finding nothing, every single time. We have become deaf. The words belong to Admiral Vladimir Chernovin, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, speaking to a closed session of the main naval staff in 1985. The full remarks remained classified until fragments surfaced in a Russian naval journal in 2009. Chernovin was not given to dramatics. He was a submariner himself, a man who had commanded a nuclear boat beneath the Arctic ice, who understood sonar physics at a level most flag officers never reached. When he said deaf, he meant it technically. The Soviet Navy's passive sonar systems had reached a detection threshold below which the Los Angeles class simply did not exist. Think about what that means. Detection wasn't merely difficult, and ranges hadn't merely shortened. The target had dropped below the noise floor of the ocean itself. The 688 at patrol speed radiated less acoustic energy than the ambient sound of the sea. The thermal cracking of the deep scattering layer, the distant grinding of ice, the biologics, the rain on the surface 1,000 feet above. An American submarine at 7 knots was quieter than the water it moved through. Soviet sonar operators weren't failing to detect a submarine. They were trying to hear something quieter than silence. The numbers, when they finally emerged in declassified assessments, were devastating. A Victor III-class submarine at patrol speed radiated roughly 160 decibels, reference to 1 micropascal at 1 meter. The early Los Angeles-class boats radiated around 120. That 40 decibel difference sounds modest until you understand the logarithmic scale. 40 decibels is not 40% quieter. It is 10,000 times quieter. The improved 688I boats that entered service in the late 1980s pushed that figure lower still. The gap didn't narrow over time. It widened. Every Soviet improvement in quieting was matched and exceeded by the next American flight block before the first improved Soviet boat reached its operating depth on its maiden patrol. I want to stay with Chernovin's briefing for a moment. He reportedly presented a chart showing detection probability against an American 688 at various ranges using the Soviet Navy's best available sonar, the MGK-503 system aboard the Akula class, their newest and quietest attack submarine. At 20 nautical miles, detection probability was near zero. At 10 miles, it reached perhaps 15% under ideal acoustic conditions. Isothermal water, no biologics, minimal shipping traffic. At 5 miles, close enough that a torpedo fired from either boat would reach the other in minutes, the probability climbed to only 40%. The chart meant that a Soviet submarine could be within killing range of an American 688 and still have better than even odds of never knowing it was there. A crew could die without their sonar ever registering the presence of the thing that killed them. That briefing changed Soviet naval strategy. Within 2 years, the Bastion concept hardened from operational preference into doctrine. Resources that might have funded blue water attack submarines were redirected toward the Typhoon-class ballistic missile boats and the infrastructure to protect them in Arctic bastions. The Soviet Navy didn't stop building attack submarines. The Akula and Sierra classes proved they could narrow the gap with enough effort and enough titanium. But the operational concept shifted. Finding American submarines in the open ocean was no longer a realistic planning assumption. It was an aspiration. Chernovin retired in 1992, months after the Soviet Union itself dissolved. In a rare interview published in a St. Petersburg newspaper in 1997, he was asked what had most concerned him during his tenure. He did not mention nuclear war or NATO surface forces. He did not mention the strategic balance. He mentioned the silence. The American submarines he could never find, operating in waters he considered sovereign, watching his fleet with a patience he described as unnerving. He used that word. A man who had spent his career beneath the polar ice, who had commanded a submarine capable of ending civilization, found the quietness of an American 688 unnerving. 14 feet. That's the clearance between the top of a 688's sail and the underside of the Arctic ice pack during a typical under-ice patrol. 14 feet of freezing black water separating a nuclear submarine from a ceiling of ice that could be 30 feet thick in places, riddled with pressure ridges that plunged downward like inverted mountains without warning. The crew couldn't surface, couldn't blow ballast in an emergency without risking a collision that would crack the hull, couldn't communicate with anyone. The boat moved at 4 knots through water that smelled, according to one officer's patrol report, like wet pennies and refrigerant, the particular cocktail of recirculated air, condensation on cold steel, and something metallic that submariners who served under the ice never forgot. The Soviets considered the Arctic their sanctuary. The Typhoon-class boats sheltered there, drifting beneath the pack ice in patrol boxes carefully mapped by Soviet hydrographic surveys, ready to launch ballistic missiles through polinyas, natural openings in the ice, on receipt of orders that everyone prayed would never come. The bastion strategy depended on one assumption, that the ice itself provided a barrier American submarines could not routinely penetrate. Soviet planners knew the Americans had conducted under-ice operations. They had read about USS Nautilus crossing the pole in 1958. They categorized those as stunts, demonstrations, not sustained operational patrols conducted in wartime conditions with weapons loaded and tracking solutions running. They were wrong. The 688s began routine Arctic patrols in the late 1970s. The operations carried alphanumeric designations that remain classified. Patrol durations, routes, specific contacts, all still locked in compartmented files at the Office of Naval Intelligence. What has emerged, mostly through retired officers speaking carefully around the edges of their secrecy obligations, is enough to reconstruct the shape of what happened. American attack submarines penetrated the Soviet Arctic bastions repeatedly, for weeks at a time, and tracked Typhoon-class missile boats at ranges close enough to maintain firing solutions. The Typhoons never detected them. The escort submarines assigned to protect the Typhoons never detected them. The entire bastion defense network, the surface ships, the helicopter-dipping sonars, the fixed acoustic arrays on the seabed, registered nothing. One retired captain, speaking to a Navy oral history project in 2004, described trailing a Typhoon for 11 days beneath the Barents ice. He could hear the Typhoon's crew conducting drills. He could hear hatches opening and closing inside the massive hull. His own boat drifted at 3 knots, reactor circulation running on natural convection. No pumps, no moving parts in the primary loop. The S-6G reactor producing power in something approaching perfect silence. The Typhoon, carrying 20 ballistic missiles with nearly 200 warheads, never knew. The Soviet sanctuary didn't exist. The bastions were permeable. The ice that Moscow believed would shield its second strike capability had American submarines underneath it, patient and invisible, holding the keys to every Typhoon in the fleet. Chernavin's word comes back. Unnerving. Except from the American side of the periscope, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like winning. The Norwegian Sea. November 1981. That Soviet sonar operator aboard the Victor III, the one who logged an American submarine as biological, filed his contact report at the end of patrol. It went to Fleet Intelligence in Murmansk. A junior analyst flagged it as a possible submarine contact. His supervisor overruled him, noting that no American submarine had been detected in the area by any other asset. The junior analyst's name isn't in the declassified portion of the file. His supervisor's is Captain Second Rank Yuri Antonov, who spent the next decade processing contact reports that followed the same pattern. Ambiguous detection. Brief. Unconfirmable. Gone. Antonov wrote a memo in 1987 arguing that the absence of confirmed detections was itself data, that the Americans had achieved a level of acoustic stealth that rendered Soviet passive sonar operationally irrelevant. The memo used the phrase systemic blindness. His superiors in Moscow acknowledged receipt. No action followed. The file carries a single annotation in red ink. Noted. He'd been right since 1981. 62 Los Angeles class submarines entered service between 1976 and 1996. They accumulated more submerged patrol hours than any submarine class in history. The total figure remains classified. During the final decade of the Cold War, at any given moment, between 6 and 12 of them operated in waters the Soviet Union considered its own. Trailing ballistic missile submarines, mapping acoustic signatures, recording propeller cavitation patterns, sitting in the dark with the patience of something that doesn't need to breathe. The smell of hydraulic fluid and old coffee hung in control rooms where men stood watch for 6 hours at a stretch, eyes fixed on sonar displays showing contacts that had no idea they were being watched. The Cold War ended without a shot fired beneath the surface. Both navies knew this was not an accident. Chernovin lives in Moscow. He published his memoirs in 2003, 800 pages, most of it concerning fleet administration and strategic planning. The chapter on anti-submarine warfare runs 11 pages. He spends 4 of them discussing the Los Angeles class. He calls it the weapon we could not answer. The Russian word he uses, orugie, means weapon in the singular, specific sense. Not a class of ships, a weapon. One instrument wielded with precision across 30 years. Antonov retired as a captain first rank in 1993. He teaches signal processing at a technical university in St. Petersburg.